Amboseli's dry flats, midday. Heat lifted in ripples from the ground and scattered across the pale earth. The air shimmered, making the horizon bend and blur. It was in the center of this wide stillness that the first sound rose. A short cry. Thin, breaking halfway through. The calf stood alone, his legs pressed awkwardly under him, knees knocking as if the weight of his body was already too much to carry. His trunk hung low and trembled as it brushed the dust. Behind him, a faint trail of prints stretched far toward the horizon where the rest of the herd had moved earlier in the morning. They were gone now, the shapes lost in heat and distance. Only the calf remained. When the sound came again, it carried farther, not a call of strength, but of strain. It was high-pitched, like a rope fraying. Rangers Elian and Sefu, driving a slow patrol across the flats, stopped their vehicle and listened. The cry came once more, shorter this time. They could see the young elephant clearly now. No more than a year old, his body still rounded in places where calves should be soft, but the skin along his ribs had already begun to press too close. He shifted uneasily, placing his weight from one foot to another, and the dust beneath him turned dark where it had been dampened with urine from fear. The rangers did not approach at once. They waited, engines off, the silence broken only by the wind dragging sand across the flats. The calf cried again, turning his head slightly toward the fading tracks. His ears lifted but quickly drooped, heavy with fatigue. Elian lowered his binoculars and spoke softly, his voice carrying only across the small distance between the two men. He should not be here. It was a plain truth. A calf of that age never survived alone. If he tried to follow the herd without them slowing for him, his legs would collapse before nightfall. If he stayed where he was, predators would close in once darkness fell. The stakes were not complicated. Either way, he would die. Sifu shifted his eyes across the horizon. Nothing moved but the wind. No sign of the herd turning back. He opened the door slowly and stepped out, keeping his body loose, non-threatening. The calf watched him, trunk twitching once before dropping again. He did not run. He was too tired to run. Another cry rose, shorter and weaker than before. The rangers marked the change. Every call that strained his chest stole energy he did not have. If he wasted what remained, he would not last another day. Elian stepped out too, the two men moving quietly toward the calf, each keeping their hands visible and low. They did not rush. Each step was measured. The calf took one step backward, then froze. His ears flapped once in confusion. Then he swayed forward again, as if gravity had decided his direction for him. The rangers stopped at a safe distance. They said nothing more. The calf's trunk lifted halfway, searching, then dropped. He shifted his weight again, stumbled once, and caught himself clumsily. The weakness was clear. His body had already begun the slow decline. The silence settled heavy across the flats. Wind rattled dry seed heads from thornbrush nearby. The calf cried one more time, softer now, like breath escaping. The sound did not travel far. Elian spoke quietly, almost to himself, though Sefu heard. If he moves, he falls. If he stays, he starves. The men stood still, the dust rising faintly at their feet, the truth undeniable. Alone on the open flats, the calf could not choose a path that kept him alive, and so, before any step forward could be taken, it was already clear. The only chance he had would depend not on his herd, but on what the rangers did next. The dust was still fresh on the ground, a wide trail pressed by dozens of heavy feet. The herd had moved east, leaving behind clear imprints that cut straight across the dry flats. Elian walked at the front, eyes fixed on the tracks, while Sefu lingered near the calf, measuring every uncertain shift of the young body left behind. The calf had tried to step forward once, dragging his right hind leg awkwardly, but the effort had ended in a stumble. He stood again now, swaying, ears drooping. his trunk lifted halfway before falling back against his chest. Another cry broke from him, sharper this time, cutting across the air. The sound did not linger long before it was lost in the heat. Elian crouched at one of the larger prints in the earth. The edges had not yet crumbled. They could not be more than an hour old. The herd was moving fast, keeping distance. He rose and looked toward the horizon where the prints dissolved into the shimmer of heat. There was no sign of them slowing, no curve in the path that might suggest hesitation. They were not coming back. Behind him, Sefu kept his gaze steady on the calf. The young elephant shifted his weight again, placing too much strain on the injured leg. He dragged it, then stopped, sides heaving. The weakness was unmistakable. "He cannot follow them," Sifu said softly. Elian nodded once. The risk was simple. If the calf forced himself to move along that trail, his body would collapse long before the tracks led to water or cover. But if he stayed here, the sun would drain him, and predators would close in when the light fell. The calf cried again. The sound was thinner now, less sharp, as if even calling cost too much. He swung his trunk outward and brushed the earth, scattering dust. His head tilted once more in the direction of the herd's trail, instinct tugging him toward the safety of a family that had already abandoned him. Elian returned to the calf's side, his movements slow, measured. He did not touch him. He only stood near enough that the animal could see he was not alone. The calf turned slightly, eyes glassy with fatigue, and shifted his weight as if preparing to step. The leg dragged once more. Dust darkened beneath the hoof where he leaned too long on the injured side. "If he follows, he dies," Elian said plainly. The words hung in the heat. Sefu moved closer, his eyes scanning the sky where vultures already circled at a distance, dark specks turning against the white glare of the sun. He felt the truth pressing harder now. Time was against them. The calf swayed again. His knees buckled once before straightening. He lifted his trunk toward the tracks as if scenting something that was no longer there. His ears lifted halfway, then fell limp again. The weakness was spreading through his body like a weight he could no longer hold. Elian knelt slowly, lowering a hand toward the dust. The calf hesitated, but did not retreat. He leaned forward slightly, nostrils twitching as he pulled in the faint scent of water from the ranger's canteen. For a moment, the tension eased, but his body sagged again quickly, his head dropping low. Sifu exhaled through his nose, watching closely. "If he stays, he starves." The two men stood in silence then, the plain truth fixed between them. The herd had made its choice. The land had drawn its line, and the calf, trembling in the heat with one leg dragging useless behind him, stood balanced between two ends that offered no mercy. Only the men could break the pattern now. Without intervention, the empty distance between the calf and the herd would remain more than space. It would be the measure of his life. Elian moved back toward the truck in silence, the weight of the canteen heavy in his hand. The sun pressed harder now, flattening every shadow until even the thorn shrubs looked bleached and brittle. Behind him, the calf swayed in place, trunk dragging across the earth as though it were too heavy to lift. Sefu stayed close, watching the young elephant's chest rise and fall with effort. The calf gave another call, softer than before, its pitch broken halfway through. Each sound grew thinner, as if pulling from a well already drained. Elian knelt slowly on the ground, his body angled sideways so he would not appear to approach directly. He unscrewed the lid, the small scrape of metal carrying faintly in the still air. The calf's ears twitched at the sound, but he did not move. Elian tipped the canteen, letting water spill into the curve of his palm. It caught the light briefly, trembling in the heat before beginning to slip through his fingers. The calf lifted his head weakly. His trunk rose, shaking as he stretched it forward, then fell short, curling back against his chest. He tried again. This time, the tip reached Elian's hand. The calf's breath was warm and shallow as his trunk brushed the water, scattering half of it into the dust before managing to sip the rest. Elian refilled his palm patiently. No sudden movements, no noise beyond the slow trickle. Again, the calf leaned forward, trunk quivering with weakness but drawn by the scent. He touched the water and pulled it to his mouth. Drops slid across the corners of his lips. His throat moved once as he swallowed. Sifu crouched a few paces away, silent but intent. The calf's ears lifted halfway, flapping once in a soft motion of relief before dropping again. The change was small but visible. Water had reached him. It had not been enough to restore his strength, but it was enough to show he could still respond. Elian poured another measure, then another. Each time the calf reached forward with less hesitation, though the effort cost him balance. Once his knee buckled and he nearly sank, but he steadied himself, desperate to lean closer again. Elian shifted his body lower, resting his elbow on his knee so the distance would not be too much. The calf's trunk lingered against his palm now, searching for every drop. When the canteen was nearly half empty, Elian sat back. The calf let out a faint moan, not loud, but long enough to carry the meaning of his need. He had not had water in too long. His body was thinning. His skin clung too tight to his ribs. The signs were plain. Without more, he would not survive another day. Sifu broke the silence, his voice calm. "He will take what we give, but it won't be enough." Elian nodded once, his eyes steady on the calf. The stakes remained clear. They had bought him time, not safety. If they pulled back now, the sun would claim what water had given. If they moved him too quickly, his body could fail under the strain. The calf lifted his head again, trunk swaying weakly in the air as if still searching. His ears twitched, then stilled. He stood, unsteady but upright, a faint line of dust clinging where his trunk had dragged in the dirt. For the first time since the rangers had seen him, he did not call out. The silence was heavy, but it carried a kind of fragile hope. Elian tightened the lid on the canteen. "This keeps him alive today," he said softly, his voice carrying only to Sifu. "But tomorrow is not certain." The calf stood between them and the endless tracks of the herd, a lone figure marked by weakness but still breathing. Each drop of water had given him a pause in the decline. Yet the truth had not changed. With no herd to guide him and no strength to travel, his life now depended entirely on the choices made here. If he followed, he would collapse. If he stayed, hunger would strip the life water could not restore, and so his survival narrowed to the space between two men, their patience and the few measures of water left in a single canteen. By late afternoon, the sky dulled to a pale gray, the horizon softening under the weight of cooling air. The wind shifted, pulling the scent of dust and dry grass across the flats. The calf had stopped trying to move. He stood pressed close to the ranger's truck, his side brushing against the metal as if the bulk of it might guard him. His body trembled with fatigue. His ears drooped, motionless except for the occasional twitch against flies. Elian crouched nearby, refilling his canteen from a small reserve, his hands steady. Sifu walked a slow circle around the truck, eyes scanning the open ground. Nothing stirred at first, then, beyond the shimmer of the plain, shapes began to form. Low, lean, and deliberate. Hyenas. They emerged in pairs, pausing to test the air before moving closer. Their movements were unhurried, patient. The sun had nearly fallen, and the calf's cries earlier in the day had carried far. The predators had heard. The calf shifted uneasily, his trunk brushing against the side of the truck as though to confirm it was still there. His legs spread wider, knees bent in weakness. He did not call again. The silence now was its own signal. Exhaustion had taken his voice. Elian rose slowly, moving to the back of the truck. He lifted a lantern, struck the flame, and set it on the ground. The small circle of light spread across the dust, fragile but firm against the creeping dusk. Sefu followed his lead, placing another lantern near the front tire, then another to the side. A faint ring of light began to glow, surrounding the calf and the vehicle in a quiet defense. The hyenas halted when the light caught their eyes. They lingered just beyond reach, pacing back and forth, their outlines stretching thin against the last rays of day. Their patience was steady. They would wait for weakness to deepen. The calf leaned harder into the truck, his flank smudged with dust. His trunk lifted halfway, then dropped. His legs shuddered once, but held. He pressed his head briefly against the metal, eyes closing for only a moment before snapping open again. Fear kept him upright. Sefu kept his voice low, calm. They'll stay through the night. Elian nodded, his hand resting on the lantern handle. The truth was plain. If they left now, the calf would not see morning. The predators would close in, silent and certain. The first call of a hyena echoed then, sharp and carrying across the flats. It was answered by another, farther back. The calf flinched, pressing closer to the truck, the tremor in his body stronger now. His ears lifted halfway, then sagged again. His breathing grew rough, each exhale catching in his throat. Elian crouched once more, pouring a trickle of water into his palm. He offered it gently, his movements slow. The calf leaned forward, sipping weakly, his trunk trembling against the ranger's hand. The water gave him only a moment's ease, but it kept him connected, reminding him of presence. The hyenas shifted again, circling wider but never leaving. Their patience was unbroken. They knew the night was long. The lanterns burned steady as the last light faded completely. Darkness wrapped the plain, broken only by the glow around the truck and the occasional gleam of eyes at the edge of vision. Inside that ring, the calf stood fragile but still alive, his flank pressed against human presence. Sefu set down one more lantern, his voice quiet as he spoke to the air between them. If he stands through this night, he may have a chance. Elian did not answer. He only watched the calf breathe, slow and uncertain, his small body trembling against the endless dark. Around them, the circle of predators waited. But within the fragile glow of light, survival held, hour by hour, against the weight of nightfall. The horizon paled to gray before the sun rose, a thin line of light stretching across the flats. The lanterns around the truck had burned low, their glow shrinking to faint halos in the dust. The night had been long but unbroken. The hyenas, kept at bay by the ring of firelight and the steady presence of the rangers, had finally slipped back into the dark before dawn. The calf stood in the same place, pressed against the side of the truck. His body sagged as though the weight of standing had nearly undone him, but he was still upright. His trunk brushed the ground softly, dragging faint lines through the dirt. His eyes, heavy with exhaustion, blinked slowly as the first hints of morning touched the plain. Elian stepped forward with calm patience, unscrewing the canteen once again. He poured water into his palm and held it low. The calf hesitated, ears twitching, then leaned forward and sipped. His trunk trembled as he pulled what little he could into his mouth. When Elian poured again, the calf followed more quickly, his lips closing around each drop with weak but steady intent. Sefu crouched near the rear of the truck, watching the way the calf's flanks lifted and fell. The breathing was shallow but less ragged now. The long night had not broken him. Still, the stakes were fixed. Without strength, water would only delay the inevitable. He needed to rise on his own, to prove that his body could still answer the demands of life. The calf shifted suddenly, his front knees bending low. For a moment it seemed he might collapse. Dust rose beneath him as his trunk pressed hard against the ground, steadying his descent. But instead of lying down, he rocked forward, struggling to push himself upright again. His hindquarters trembled, legs shaking under his weight. The injured leg dragged slightly behind, stiff and reluctant. Elian and Sefu froze, silent witnesses. The calf's ears flared once, his trunk curling against the earth as he forced himself upward. His knees buckled, dropping him halfway before he pushed again. A low moan broke from his chest, strained and raw. But he did not stop. The second attempt lifted him higher, his body swaying dangerously, almost tipping sideways. He braced, trunk stretched wide for balance. Dust clung to the edges of his skin, marking where he had pressed the ground. Then, with one final heave, he straightened enough to stand. The rangers let out a slow breath, though neither spoke. The moment was fragile, but real. The calf stood fully on his legs, trembling with the effort but upright. For several seconds he did not move. His ears lifted weakly, flapping once as though acknowledging the new air of morning. He shifted his weight forward, testing the stance. The injured leg dragged but held. Sefu spoke in a quiet voice that barely broke the silence. If he can rise, he can try. Elian gave a single nod. The truth was plain. Standing was not survival, but it was the first step toward it. If he could push himself up today, then with food and more water he might have a chance to continue tomorrow. The calf swayed, then took a single step forward. His trunk brushed the ground in a slow, searching arc. He stood there, breathing heavily before taking another. Each step was uncertain, but each proved the same truth. He had not surrendered. The sun lifted above the flats, casting a golden sheen across the dust. The calf's small shadow stretched long, thin but present. It marked him still among the living. The rangers remained at his side, silent in their watching. They knew the risk was far from gone. A single stumble could undo the fragile strength he had found. Hunger still hollowed his frame and his hurt had not returned. But as the first full light touched the plain, the calf stood on his feet, trembling but alive. And that alone was enough to keep hope moving forward into the day. By mid-morning, the flats shimmered again under the returning heat. The calf had managed a few more steps since dawn, each one hesitant, his trunk brushing the ground as if searching for direction. He stayed near the truck, circling no farther than a few meters before pausing to rest. His ears twitched often, catching at sounds the rangers could not hear. Elian shaded his eyes with one hand, scanning the horizon. The trail of the calf's own herd stretched farther east, already fading in the distance. No dust rose behind them, no sign of slowing. Their absence settled heavier with each passing hour. The calf swayed on his legs, then stopped suddenly. His ears lifted high, spreading wide, the skin pulled taut as he held still. His trunk curled upward, pausing in the air. For the first time since morning, his posture changed not from weakness but from awareness. Elian froze too, eyes narrowing. Sefu tilted his head, listening. At first there was nothing but the drag of wind over the flats. Then, faint but certain, it came, a low rumble, rolling across the distance like distant thunder. Not storm, not sky, elephants. The calls carried again, layered and deep. The calf shifted sharply, his body trembling with effort as he lifted his head higher. His ears flapped once, then again, wide and insistent. A sharp cry broke from his chest, high-pitched and raw, straining through exhaustion. He called back. Elian and Sefu turned south. Dust shimmered on the edge of the horizon, faint at first, then gathering in a slow-moving cloud. Shapes began to form within it, heavy bodies striding in a line, another herd moving steady toward the sound. The calf cried again, his voice cracking in the middle, but he did not stop. He pushed the sound out of his chest as if every note carried his will to survive. The wind caught it and pulled it farther, carrying it to those approaching. The rangers exchanged a glance, silent but sharp with recognition. This was not the herd that had abandoned him. These elephants had been drawn by his voice, their route pulled by a call too young to be ignored. Sefu spoke quietly, his tone even. "They've heard him." The calf took 2 staggering steps forward, nearly tripping as his injured leg dragged. His trunk lifted, reaching for the air, his eyes fixed on the approaching cloud of dust. The trembling in his body no longer came only from weakness but from something else. A surge of recognition that life was moving toward him, not away. The herd grew clearer with each minute. Broad shoulders swayed, tusks glinted in the sun, and calves smaller than him trotted between the legs of their mothers. The sound deepened, a chorus of low rumbles and calls that spread across the plain like the ground itself was speaking. The abandoned calf cried again, his ears wide and shaking. His trunk curled, then stretched forward, searching. The herd answered with a rolling chorus, steady and full, closing the space between them. Elian stepped back slowly, signaling Sefu to do the same. This moment did not belong to men. It belonged to the pull of voices that carried across distance and stitched lives together again. The calf moved forward another step, nearly falling but catching himself. Dust clung to his knees. He lifted his trunk higher, his body trembling as the herd drew near. Elian's voice was low, spoken more to the air than to anyone else. If they take him, he may live. The herd pressed closer, their presence now undeniable. The sound of many feet shook the ground faintly beneath the ranger's boots. The air carried the scent of them, musky, warm, alive. The calf's cries grew sharper, thinner, but constant. Each call was answered. The distance between them narrowed. And in that narrowing, hope shifted from fragile chance to something real. The rangers stood still, watching the line of elephants approach. What the wind had carried was not just sound, but the first possibility of belonging. The herd slowed as they neared the truck, their pace steady but cautious. Dust rose around their feet, drifting low across the flats before settling again. At the front stood the matriarch, her ears wide and her head held firm. She paused just beyond the line of lanterns that still lay dim at the truck's base, their faint glass glinting in the sun. The calf froze at the sight of them. His body trembled with exhaustion, but his trunk lifted high, curling in short, unsteady arcs as he pulled in the new scent. His ears flapped once, weak but eager. Then, with a sudden lurch, he stumbled forward, dragging his injured leg through the dust. The rangers did not move. They kept their bodies still, their eyes fixed on the matriarch. This moment belonged to her. She shifted her weight, trunk rising into the air, tasting the scent that carried from the calf. The herd behind her fanned out in a loose half-circle, their younger ones tucked inside the safe line of broad bodies. The calf cried once, the sound thin and desperate. It caught in the air and fell quickly, but it was enough. He took another step forward, then another, nearly falling with the effort. Dust clung to his knees where he stumbled. The matriarch remained still for a long breath. Her trunk swayed side to side, then dipped lower. The herd murmured behind her, soft rumbles moving through their chests. Silence followed. Even the wind seemed to hold. Then, slowly, she stepped forward. Her size filled the space between the herd and the calf, her presence unmistakable. She lowered her trunk, first brushing the earth, then lifting it toward him. The calf stopped trembling for a moment, eyes wide. When her trunk touched his back, the sound that broke from him was not a cry, but a soft exhale, long and shuddering. His body sagged under the weight of relief. His ears flapped weakly as she drew her trunk across his spine in one firm, slow motion. Acceptance. The herd shifted then, their bodies easing. A young female stepped forward behind the matriarch, her trunk curling briefly toward the calf before dropping again. Another rumble spread through them, deep and steady, as if the decision had been made. The calf pressed himself forward, his body brushing against the matriarch's leg. He leaned into her as though the contact itself could hold him upright. His trunk curled against her skin and rested there. Elian let out a slow breath, quiet enough that Sefu barely heard. Neither man spoke beyond that. They knew words would add nothing to what had just been decided. The stakes shifted instantly. Hours before, the calf's survival had rested solely on what the rangers could give: water, light, and patience. Now, with one gesture, the balance had changed. If the herd claimed him, his chance of living grew beyond anything the men could offer. If they rejected him, the risk remained final. But there was no rejection. The matriarch's touch was plain. The herd had opened their space. The calf moved another step closer, nearly collapsing but caught gently as her trunk brushed him again, steadying him. She released a low rumble, answered softly by others behind her. The sound surrounded him like a boundary, pulling him into its safety. Sefu whispered, more to himself than anyone else, "They've taken him." Elian nodded once, his eyes fixed on the small body leaning against the great weight of the herd. For a breath, silence lingered, the kind that only comes when risk begins to lift. The calf stood within their circle now, trembling but no longer alone, and with that, the choice between life and death no longer belonged to distance or men. It had been placed in the hands and the trunk of the herd itself. By dusk, the heat had eased, leaving the flats washed in a softer light. The sky bent low with color, streaks of gold and pale rose sliding across the horizon. Within that calm, the herd began to move again, their pace steady and unhurried, every step carried with the weight of belonging. The calf was no longer outside their circle. He walked pressed between two older siblings, their flanks brushing against his sides, their bodies shielding him from the edges of the world. His steps were uneven, his injured leg still dragging, but each stumble was caught by the press of bodies around him. Where he faltered, they steadied. Where he slowed, they matched his pace. The matriarch led at the front, her trunk swaying in long arcs that marked both direction and calm. From her, the rhythm spread backward, guiding the others into a single movement. The sound of their feet rose together, a low percussion that seemed to steady the plane itself. Elian and Sefu remained by the truck, standing silent as the herd passed. They did not move closer, did not interfere. The space belonged to the elephants now. The rangers had carried the calf through the edge of night, but his life had been handed back to where it was always meant to rest. The calf turned his head once, his trunk lifting weakly into the air. He did not call, but the gesture was enough, a small signal that he had not forgotten the ones who had stood with him when there was no herd to answer. Then he tucked himself back against the side of the older female guiding him, his ears brushing her skin as he leaned close. The herd's rumbles rolled across the flats, each one low and certain. The calf answered only by keeping pace, his silence now part of their sound. His cries, so sharp and thin the day before, had given way to the deeper voices of those who had claimed him. Sefu exhaled quietly, his words almost lost to the wind. "He walks because they let him." Elian's reply was simple. "And because he still can." The truth was plain. Survival remained fragile. Hunger still hollowed his frame and his strength was far from certain. But he was no longer a calf standing alone in the dust. He was a body among bodies, moving as one, held by the rhythm of a herd that had made space for him. The rangers watched as dust rose behind the line of elephants, soft plumes lifted by many feet. The herd stretched wide across the plain, their shadows lengthening as the sun dipped lower. The calf's small form disappeared slowly into the swell of movement, no longer separate, no longer defined by absence. The men did not follow. They stood at the edge of the flats until the last of the herd's shapes blurred against the horizon, their rumbles fading into distance. The air carried silence again, broken only by the wind. The miracle had not been rescue. It had not been the water in a hand or the lanterns that pushed predators back. It had been this, the return to a circle of belonging that no man could create. Elian lowered the empty canteen at his side. Sefu brushed the dust from his boots. Neither spoke further. There was nothing more to say. Across the horizon, the final trace of the herd settled into dusk. Dust drifted low, then fell back to the ground, erasing the path of their passing. Only the memory remained, of a calf who had cried into emptiness, and of the wind that had carried his voice far enough for an answer to come.